I remember vividly, I went to visit a close friend, a young woman that we used to double date with my girlfriend. They were best friends. And I went to see her in a hospital. She had minor foot surgery, had a cast on both feet. It was just the two of us, and we were talking, making jokes about each other. And I gave her a kiss on the cheek and was walking out. And I remember vividly walking down this hall and looking at this hospital. And I thought to myself, I could never stand one night in a dreary place like this. Then some voice came out, a man with a heavy accent said, "Young man, you're good looking. You have such nice skin." I remember feeling a little embarrassed, and I saw my reflection. Yeah, I had a tan. It was August. I never knew that 4 days later, I'd wind up in that very hospital for 167 days in a row, barely hanging on to life. Let me tell you about my collision with human mortality. After I graduated from high school, I somehow talked my way into a job in a stock brokerage firm. There was never enough excitement in life. Couldn't go to enough parties, have enough social life, but it was always the extreme sports, always something extreme. And I started flying airplanes, having had a fascination all my life with aviation. And then I found out it was a lot more fun jumping out of them. And after only 20 jumps, I became a professional skydiver. I was a gymnast, I was an athlete, but mostly I envisioned in my mind as a little boy flying like Superman. So I was fulfilling the visual fantasy I had as a little kid. Now I was doing it for real. It was a Thursday night, August 15th, 1968, just a few days after I had this encounter in the hospital with my friend, that going up with two other professional skydivers and two students to make what was to be a routine jump. We were going to let two students out, one of them out at 2,800 feet for his first jump. He had never been in an airplane before. The second student was going to make a jump from 4,000 feet. It was his 10th jump, and that would be a 20-second delay. We were going to go up very high altitude, 13,500 feet. For that time was a pretty high altitude jump, which we would get 66 seconds of free fall. That's like forever, where we would do our aero maneuvers and practice. And for me, to get in and out of airplane took about as much motivation or courage as to get in and out of a car. I was 19 years old. I was oblivious of right and wrong, of death. I was bulletproof. I wasn't never afraid to get in an airplane, and I certainly was never afraid to jump. People would say, you must have been an adrenaline junkie. No, I was doing it for the pleasure. I'm convinced the number one motivation of any human life is pleasure, is finding pleasure. And this was, for me, the ultimate pleasure. I remember waving at the people on the ground, the groupies, or the woofos, we called them. Woofo, you jump out of an airplane. Or groundhogs, they hang around the ground, but they never jump. Waving at them, and then we took off. And by that time, I was kind of annoyed about flying. It took so long to get to the altitude. I was so motivated just to open that door and get out of the airplane. And as I was actually closed my eyes and was going to take a little rest, the plane had taken off. And this was a newer airplane, only a week old for this pilot. And he thought it was extremely powerful. So he really had a very steep climb of ascent. And suddenly I was awakened by an unusual sound, dead silence. And the pilot screamed at me and said, "Oh my God, we're going down." We had a total engine failure, and we had a loss of our airplane's lift. That's the force that makes the airplane fly. So we basically dropped straight down. It'd be the equivalent of letting a car on a cable go. And we were headed right to the ground. And I don't remember that part of it. The last thing I remember is the pilot said, "That's it." And he hit me in the shoulder. And I was sitting on the floor next to him. I'm sure that the view out of the windshield was, everybody is going to die. We impacted a tree going probably 100 miles an hour. My face, I wasn't in a seatbelt. I was thrown forward, and my face stopped my body going 100 miles an hour. So I sustained, obviously, very serious head injury. The airplane cartwheeled wing over wing and then was wedged into the ground. There was shock and confusion. The four other occupants besides the pilot, their heads kind of crashed into each other. So the two students were injured. Their faces were busted by the other guys' helmets. And one of the professionals helped the two of them escape. And my partner in this new adventure was just leaving the aircraft, was just a few feet away when the plane exploded. And when he went inside, he heard screaming, and he knew that I was trapped inside, as well as the pilot. I had my leg sticking out a hole in the side of the aircraft where the wing had been attached, and with this hand, I was pulling and trying to free myself, but something had caught me, had a hold of my harness and my clothing, and I was trapped inside, soaked with airplane fuel, and on fire from head to toe, literally burning alive. And this was one of these moments where this man had one of these experiences like superhuman strength where someone could lift up a car. He literally pulled the skydiving harness loose with his bare hands, dragged me away, and began to roll me on the ground and put the fire out. He pulled so hard, he pulled his thumbs out of the sockets of his hands and tried to get the fire out. And when he did, he said, "Get up and run," because he was afraid there was going to be another explosion from the wing that was drained of gasoline that was empty. I remember I was very fuzzy, but I remember taking about 10 steps. I remember then falling over backwards, my head hitting the ground. And I put my hand back to feel, and I came and looked, and the back of my head was stuck to the palm of my hand. And then I just flopped over. And the next thing I remembered, I was in an ambulance. And that ambulance was racing towards the closest little hospital, the one I'd been in just a few days before, and said I could never stand to be in a place like this for one night. I'll never forget the sound of the whine of that ambulance. And I didn't know how bad I was hurt, but I was looking up at the ceiling while strapped down to the gurney. And for the first time in my life, a man who was self-sufficient, strong in every way for myself, I could do anything I wanted if I just applied myself a little bit. For the first time in my life, a person that didn't know God or ever seek God or ever know that I'd even needed God cried out for the first time, "God, help me. I'm sorry. I want another chance." And then there was the bright lights of the emergency room. They rolled me in. They let me talk to my mother, whom they had contacted, for about 60 seconds. And I heroically defended skydiving as if I was like a martyr going to be burned at the stake. She said, "Does it have anything to do with skydiving? This was an airplane accident." And then I asked her to see a certain Catholic priest who had scared me when I was just a young boy, and to have him come pray for me. And that was very profound. And the next thing I know, I was whisked in to surgery, and I don't remember anything more that night. The doctors never expected me to live through the night. They thought I would surely die of shock. The assessment of my injuries after they took me in that night was I had a severe head injury, a contusion of my brain. I had massive third-degree burns over a major part of my body, well over 50% of my body. I had second-degree burns over other parts of my body. I had lacerations. My face was torn from here all the way up to here, wide open. I was blind in my right eye. My skin was so badly burned that my sister described what she saw as like part of my body looked like a hot dog that had fallen into a campfire. It was blackened, crusty, burnt skin. And so that morning, when I woke up, or what I remember as the consciousness I had, basically there was a stream of people they let in, family, friends, almost anybody who wanted to see me, because they were pretty much letting people to come in, I think, to say goodbye. And I remember vividly some people came in, they looked at me and just fainted. I remember one of my friends was the first person I had ever met. He said, "Well, what happened?" I said, "Well, planes don't fly too good on the ground." I didn't know how bad I was hurt, and I really didn't know what was going on, but I vividly remember certain things in the faces of people. I was laying there flat, I had no strength, but they would hover over, look at me, and they did their best to try and not register the shock that they were seeing. But I went from being a picture of health to a picture of absolute hopelessness. I had lost everything in a moment. And what is worse about the initial types of injuries I had are the complications that could follow. And though I survived that first day, and they began all the heroics of emergency therapies for a burn victim, which included they would wrap my body in towels and soak me with this fluid called silver nitrate, which is a cauterizing agent that is to get rid of the dead skin, because infection breeds on dead tissue. They either would cauterize it with that fluid, or they would literally take instruments and cut the skin off of me, sometimes when I was awake without pain medicine. And 1 day or 2 days and 3 days went by, and some of the complications that occurred very rapidly was there was an immediate massive amount of weight loss. And it's because just the evaporation process and the caloric burn, because these from this energy is the equivalent of about 40,000 calories a day. And I was taking in hardly anything. So I went from 170 some pounds of pretty much solid muscle, almost no body fat. Then in a few weeks, I went down to 90 pounds. That was one horrible thing, was the tremendous loss of body mass. I was burned and there was infection over many parts of my body. This part of my body was so badly burned, they were considering amputating my right arm. I had developed internal bleeding where I was bleeding. It's recorded 10 pints of blood a day. Pretty serious leak. I think somebody should go down to the auto parts store and got some stop leak, and I could have done several shots. Maybe that would have helped. I don't know. I know they didn't think I was going to live, but they were heroically treating me with all the latest thing of medicine, but I got worse and worse and worse. Some of the other complications were that the nerves in both of my legs from the knee down had died, and my feet were withered up like dead bird claws. And there was, whatever was the cause of that, the lack of nutrition, lack of circulation, whatever, there was complete nerve damage from below my knees all the way down the end of my toes. I had internal infection. My blood was infected. I had sepsis. That's where the inside, the lining in your body is infected. And they tried all that they could. And finally, as I was really just getting worse and worse, and sometimes I was in a coma. Sometimes, by in a coma, I'm talking about totally unconscious where I couldn't be awakened. Sometimes I was in kind of a blurry state. And sometimes I was super conscious and I can remember vivid things. And it is strange that the man who saved my life, who was my partner, who had mentored me in skydiving in this short but successful career, he would never let me say or think anything negative. I remember when I first saw my hand, how badly it was burned, that I told him it looks like a piece of blank. And he says, don't ever say that. And I remember one time, at a particular time, I was in a coma and my sister had come to visit me. My sister was so afraid to see me because she was afraid I would die in front of her. I never remember seeing her. I was never awake. But when this man would get off the elevator, I would wake up out of a coma because he always told me that I was going to live. He always told me never to think anything bad, that I was going to be back out skydiving with him again. And I remember vividly him scolding me for saying negative things. That's ironic, isn't it? I mean, everything about me was negative. There was nothing that was going on that was hopeful. And my situation continued to deteriorate until they had done everything they knew how to do. And I got worse and worse and worse. And they called in a specialist from one of the most famous hospitals in the United States. And he examined me. And at the end of his summary, with all these terrible paragraphs about the conditions that I had, it's much worse when you read it in black and white. He simply wrote, there is nothing I can offer this young man. Basically, he was saying, it's hopeless. And they quit trying to save my life and were just waiting for me to die, for nature to take its course. But God, being rich in mercy, was going to intervene as I was entering the valley of the shadow of death. I'm going to tell you a little something that happened a little bit earlier in this experience. I'd been a person that I don't remember being very sick in my life ever or being hurt. Now suddenly everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. And my oldest sister, her father-in-law was a very prominent surgeon who had just come back from donating 13 months of his life to doing surgery on the war victims of the civilians in Vietnam. He did 12 hours a day. They would just take a bucket of water and throw it on the operating table and put another child on there who had horrific war injuries, like a piece of shrapnel would hit them in the arm and there'd be no flesh. Everything perfect from here, everything perfect here, but nothing here. He would do like a drastic attempt and have one blood vessel and somehow save a life. He would be sued in this country. He had seen the worst possible injuries you can see to a human being. Burns, explosions, you name it. And he was a personal friend of mine who knew my health, knew my character, knew everything about me. We're actually personal friends. We had similar interests. And he came to see me close to the beginning. I remember vividly, he bent over and he was talking to me. He says, "You just eat everything they put in front of you." And he got up and he put his little hat on and he walked out. And I remember as he was going out, I was beside him going down the hall. And I was wondering, why wasn't he paying attention to me? And I was just wondering that. And then he stepped on the little rubber mat that is an automatic door opener. And all of a sudden, the door, as it opened, it went right through me. My spirit had gone out of my body and was following him. Now, at that time, I'd never heard of anything about out-of-the-body experiences or spiritual things. Hey, I'm just a regular human being who was hot for skydiving. That was my first remembrance of super natural existence or paranormal things. No one ever told me about this, but all of a sudden, as soon as that happened, I thought, whoa. And like a bungee cord, my spirit was pulled back into my body. And again, there I was suffering on this in the intensive care unit. But now, after this doctor, this specialist had declared to all the other doctors that there was no hope, I literally was medically, scientifically hopeless. Now, I'm a person that believes in hope, but everything that adds up medically, I had 7 fatal complications, all compiled at once, and they were just waiting for me to die. And the day before what I'm about to tell you of this very supernatural experience, I was in a coma, and I remember vividly a doctor on my left side with the bars up. He had a clipboard in his hand, and he was speaking to a nurse on the other side saying, "When this patient, Mr. Robinson, dies, I want you to completely sanitize this entire area and bring that patient, Mr. Rogers, in here." And I was thinking to myself, remember, I'm in a coma. You could stick a scalpel in me and I wouldn't feel it. You could stick a fork in me and I wouldn't feel it. And I'm thinking, no, I'm not going to die. That's way premature. And even though I couldn't see and I couldn't hear, spiritually, I could perceive and hear everything. That's why I tell people, if you talk to somebody in the hospital, even if they tell you they can't see, if there's spirits in there, you can talk to them. And they can even hear you and even make decisions while they're in this seemingly unconscious state. That's where I was on this particular day. The next day, when the doctor examined me, which was before 7 o'clock in the morning, he went right to his office and called my sister and said, "Barbara, you better come here because your brother's not going to be here this afternoon." My body had got into what they now call active death. They had me propped up so I could breathe a little better. I was burning up with a fever. They had this vinyl pad underneath the sheet to try and, because I was so injured and so raw, they couldn't do ice packs or alcohol rubs to try and break the fever down. I was burning up with a fever and freezing at the same time. I was so uncomfortable. There is no pain medicine that could stop this kind of pain. I also had developed massive external bed sores. Both heels, the backside, parts of my back were open holes that my bones were sticking through, visibly through open sores on my flesh. I was in this horrible condition, so uncomfortable, living literally from one breath to another. And just before my brother came in to see me, I was looking out over the edge of the bed, and it was like there was an invisible opening through the wall, and I was looking in and saw this stainless steel table that was in pathology, which is the morgue. And my brother all of a sudden appeared next to me. I could tell you exactly what he was wearing. And I said, "Robert, how did you get in here?" And he goes, "What do you mean?" Same way I always do. I said, "This is the morgue." I'm sure he probably thought I was delirious. And the next thing I know, he was gone, and I was shaking so badly. And then suddenly, at the height of all human discomfort, at a place is very hard to describe physically, I was fighting to live, but life, it felt like, was ebbing out of me. It was like if there was someone throwing switches inside of my switch box to an off, this organ off, this body function off. I could feel life leaking out of me. All of a sudden, my spirit left my physical body, not as it did that first experience that I had. I was immediately thrust into a spiritual dimension. Simultaneously, there was awareness of things I had no comprehension of, all occurring at the same time. I knew instantly, this spirit man, this is the real me. I looked and examined myself. I was normal. Everything about me was normal. At the same time, I realized this spiritual world is a real world. Everything about this world is more dynamic. Everything, every color is more than colorful. The edges of everything were razor sharp, and the sight and the sensation is so awe-inspiring and so shocking. You don't think to try and reason and ask questions. It's total revelatory experience. The biggest shock, the most compelling thing that was occurring to me is I instantly understood eternity. See, everything in this life, everything in the creative dimension, everything even as far as telescopes can see that are in the physical plane are related to time. Even if they say it's billions of years, it still has a beginning and an end. Something starts, it stops. Something is new, it gets old. Every living thing that's born will die, but everything in the spirit dimension is everlasting. That struck me, and it was a shock to understand and comprehend eternity. And as I was looking, I saw in the distance a white, that I can only describe, it looked like a white circle or a white portal of pure white light that was brighter than 1,000 times the sun, but it was pure whiter than, I described it as the whitest snow, and I felt like a peace emanating from it, and I had no control of what was going on. And it was almost, I was on a slightly upward glide path going towards it, and I felt this was good and peaceful. And as I was getting close to it, I felt like a pressure on my right side, and I turned and I looked, and instantly, again, I had this multiple experience of understanding and revelation. I looked into something that was blacker than the blackest black. I also was aware that it was an abyss. It was a bottomless pit of endlessness, and that I instantly knew that if a person would go in there, they would be super conscious, but no, forever they would be cut off from the source of all life. It'd be like if I would pick them up and dip them in a swimming pool of black ink, and they would be super conscious, but they would know they would never see anybody, feel anything, experience anything. They'd be cut off from all the source of everything that has to do with life. And this darkness, this blackness, this place that is called the outer darkness was closing. It was closing in and beginning to eclipse as I was almost to this portal of white light. And I began to scream out in my spirit the same thing I had said in the ambulance, on the operating table, or at 2 o'clock in the morning when they gave me the largest legal dose of pain medicine. And 5 minutes later, it had never touched the pain I was experiencing. I just say, God, help me. I'm sorry. Give me another chance. Now I'm very, very literally standing on the precipice, the edge of eternity, knowing if that closes, this sliver of white light, if that closes, I'm gone forever and cut off for eternity. And so I cried out, no, God, please, I want to live. I want to be alive. Give me another chance. And then I was thrust through this portal like a rush of white light, took me right in, and I exploded. And I was standing in the very presence of God, what I know now to be a place that is called the third heaven. And as I was standing there, instantly multiple revelations, totally different, totally profound. I knew I would live forever and ever and ever. I would live for eternity. Simultaneous to that, anything that was wrong with me forever, the slightest memory of anything bad I did, the slightest inconvenience, pain, everything was gone. Even things such as muscle memory from fright, nothing negative will be permitted, will be existing in the presence of God. And as if it was literally, I experienced what it was like as if I had never done anything wrong. Again, simultaneous to this beautiful ecstasy experience, I could feel the undiluted, perfect love of God for me. No longer was my identity Mickey Robinson, who grew up in a little town outside of Cleveland, Ohio. Mickey Robinson, who grew up in a dysfunctional family. Mickey Robinson, who was a former skydiver, now a stockbroker, snow skier, extreme sport. And Mickey Robinson, who did good and bad. It was that I was a son of God. How could this happen? No one told me about this. And what was heaven like? What did I see? Well, for me, in my experience, I did not see any other creatures. I didn't see relatives. I didn't see angels. I didn't see little fat angels flying around with little wings, playing harps or anything like that. As artists try to make conceptions of what they perceive heaven to be. But what I saw was so stunning and astounding. I can only try and put it in terms that you can understand. Whatever structures I saw appeared to be like translucent, see-through jewels, but every color, and in colors I didn't even know exist, you could see them. And I could see, it's like I could see 360 degrees. And though the presence of God was somewhere, I could feel it to my immediately left. And I didn't see, the New Jerusalem, pearly gates, Peter checking off IDs, you're here, you're in, you're out of here. Didn't see any creatures or anything like that. But this was so stunning and so shocking, the reality of pure love, the reality of being absolutely a perfect being. And I was standing in something that, if I could describe it, it'd be like this. If you could see with your natural eyesight radiation waves, you can't see it with your natural vision, but it was a vibrating river of light with like little golden specks in it going from my left through me between my hips and my knees, vibrating, going right through me. And it's called the river of life. Everything that river touches comes completely alive. Everything that river touches is completely clean. Everything that river touches erases anything negative. There's nothing allowed to be in God's presence but love, beauty, and glory. Everything that existed, that I saw, is alive, and all of it worships God out of love and out of pleasure and out of response to who he is, because everything in heaven is like him. And it's very hard to describe in earthly terms, because it is so supernatural. It's so unearthly. I tell people jokingly, it says, hey, it's really easy to be spiritual in heaven. You're not going to have bad people doing bad things. You're not going to have bad mood swings. And they can say, isn't it going to get boring? No, David wrote that in his presence is the fullness of joy, and from his right hand, pleasures forever and ever and ever. How much could there be? There will be an endless revelation of God's goodness and God's pleasure, on and on and on. And we don't think in those terms, because when we're here, we have boxes, compartments, and limits on everything. But in heaven and in God's presence and who God is and who you can be when you're united with God is unlimited. That's why we call it mysteries. Mysteries, the secret things, are for those people who have come to know him in relationship. In Mark chapter 4, which is the parable of the sower, Jesus had been to this one region once before, and at that time he did all kinds of signs and wonders. So he came again, and now the crowds were so large that he actually got in a boat and pushed back to create a little space between him and the crowd may have crushed him. And he told them the parable of the sower. And there were 4 conditions. 1, first a bird comes and steals it. Number 2, the plant comes up and the sun burns it and withers away. 3, it grows and matures, and then it's ready to bear fruit, but thorns and thistles come up and choke it out. And 4, it falls into good soil where it bears fruit 30, 60, and 100-fold. He does this teaching, and all the people, it says, and everybody left, except the disciples and the other followers. And he said to them, to you, it's been granted to comprehend, to understand, to come into a relationship with the mystery of the kingdom. And these things that I'm going to tell you are mysteries. I never heard of such things. No one ever told me these things. But the mysteries began to produce life, and out of this life comes new life. Now, people say, tell me, what was it like? I can only say it is the highest high, that the frequency of your spirit is looking for the frequency of God's spirit. It's like in the old days when we used to have radios that you'd have to tune, find the right signal, and you get it close, and then bang, you get it right on. Well, God has put, Scripture says, Ecclesiastes, he has set eternity in your heart. Everybody's looking for that signal, but there's such an opportunity to substitute other pleasures and other things for the things that will really mean the most to you, will really affect you most. As I was standing in God's presence, I say, well, how long was it? It's as if it was eternal. It could have been a million years. What opened before me was a large open vision that was more than a vision. It wasn't like a flat screen TV, which I wish I had the dimensions for. I could have invented it before the other people did. But it was more like three-dimensional hologram. And I was seeing from the moment of the accident for about 6.5 years to the future, people I had never met, yet I felt like I was to have a relationship with them. I saw the whole explosion of the whole drug culture, how there was some really negative things about that. I saw the whole importance of music. I was seeing moments, days, places, things that I would have no way of comprehending, and they would come to pass in the future. Most of it seemed chronological. Some of it then was a little bit out of sync. I saw my wife 5 years before we met. I saw the first house that we were going to live in. It was a little farmhouse in Ohio. And I remember I was standing by this rusty gate and I had my arm on it, and I could feel the sunlight on my arm, and I could smell the lilac bushes that were growing there. And I turned and I saw this pretty young blonde woman walking towards me, and there was this sense of peace and wonder. And this was 6 years, this was going to happen 6 years in the future. And then I saw myself with a small group of people coming down a tropical mountaintop. And I noticed that there was talking. Suddenly I was drawn into the matrix of the vision right up close, and it was me talking. And I was saying, so this is paradise. And what was really happening was to take place in the future. It was a place in a Caribbean island that I had received some money many years later that was going to buy property and live on top of this thing and build this little geodesic dome and just get away from the troubles of the world. And the Lord stopped me from doing that, and because He brought to my remembrance that experience. I was really, in one way, trying to escape what I saw was the futility of this world. I said, I'll just live in a nice, peaceful place like Jamaica and eat bananas and fruit and pull people up and down the beach behind a parachute. And I don't want to bother anybody. I just want to be nice. I just want to love and be nice to everybody. And the Lord showed me there is no paradise on earth. You can't go back to the garden. If you don't have the kingdom of God in you, you'll never find it anywhere. And the Lord shut that down. And I was drawn into the intensity of that vision. Just like when I saw the outer darkness, it was as if I was already experiencing it. But when I cried out and said, God, I'm sorry. I want to be alive. Give me another chance. God heard me the moment I did it. But the reality of experiencing the cleansing in the third heaven was something He allowed me to experience that I could take back what perfect love really is, what total forgiveness really is, what having your sins washed away where you're as white as snow is a reality. It is not religious language. It's a living reality that I actually experienced, and now I understand. And I believe everybody needs to have a personal encounter. And you don't have to have a near-death experience. You don't have to come to some kind of crisis. Everybody needs a personal, not a second-hand, but a personal encounter with the love of God. And then the vision dissolved, and again, I was in the presence of God. Immediately, God spoke to me, not in words like I'm talking now, which are symbolic of meanings that you and I understand, a higher form of understanding, which is pure spirit to spirit. And I understood His words were, I was going back to the earth. And in the same way I arrived by the Spirit, I left the third heaven, passed through the second heaven, passed through the earth's atmosphere, and I could feel my back touching the roof of the hospital and going through that material, and my spirit sinking into my physical body. If you can imagine if you were some kind of like wind and you were being blown into like a bushy thing, I could feel my spirit go into my body. And then the room materialized around me, like kind of like they beam up on Star Trek. And all of a sudden, the man that had 7 fatal complications was now alive. And out of my mouth, I was worshiping God in this beautiful song in His heavenly language. I had never heard anything about that. And I was so stunned when I woke up that I looked, I was like beside myself. I thought, what is going on? And this person that was completely destroyed was now alive. It was when I woke up, I just didn't wake up. I was super conscious. And it wasn't that I had the remembrance of this ecstasy in heaven, the love of God that I experienced, the person of God that I experienced, and that river of life that I experienced was now inside me. Suddenly, I had the ability to perceive, to understand, and discern all of what was going on in these 5 or 6 doctors and nurses, that they were completely terrified. And I was so full of love and peace, I felt bad that they felt bad. How could somebody who was completely uncomfortable, nothing actually had changed in me physically, I had all the same symptoms, all the same fatal complications, but now I was more alive and I was full of peace. Before God ever healed me, the Spirit of God was able to comfort me. I want somebody to tell me that without drugs, how did that happen? How could I have a peace that is so peaceful it goes beyond comprehension? It's peace that surpasses understanding. I felt bad for these people that were all just scared to death of what they had seen. This defied everything they knew scientifically. They were probably getting ready to write orders for what I had seen in that vision of the morgue. But now I was more than alive. I was alive spiritually and full of a love that is not human. I was full of the love of God and had perfect peace. And as they looked at me, what was ever left of my face must have had some kind of peaceful grin on it. And I felt love for everything. The feel of touch of some people, because everything was enhanced for me spiritually, some people would even touch the bed and I could feel the positive energy come out of them. Other people would make you really recoil because they were annoyed, disliked you or something like that. And then after I experienced, was so full of the Holy Spirit, it would really bother me if I would even hear like a doctor raise his voice to a nurse, or even with tension there. I felt bad for both people. I didn't like judge them. I just felt like, well, that's not good. And I didn't know about, I was so full of love. I didn't judge anything except like, oh, I feel bad for that person being like that. I mean, I wish I could be like that now, because it's probably the healthiest I ever was, when everything was trash, but everything was love. I loved everything. A little fly came in and landed on my head. Oh, little fly, look at the color through your wings. It's so, you could come anytime. Today, I'd smack get you out of here, I loved everything, and I never had a bad thought. No one had to tell me about racism. I remember there was a cover of TV Guide had the Supremes on it. And I said to my girlfriend's mother, I said, she's really pretty. She goes, well, yeah, for a black person. I thought, how strange. I didn't judge her. I just thought I just was seeing, everything was beautiful to me. Everything was beautiful. Everything was love. I mean, it really was a baptism of love. That was more amazing than all of the healings, was being baptized in love. And it's still the thing that undoes me more than anything else. They were still waiting and expecting me to die. That day passed, and the next day, and they actually found more wrong with me. And even though I had all these terrible complications, they began to cooperate medically with something they didn't understand, because God began to heal me and restore me. I gradually began to get better. They found out that, in addition to all my other complications, the lower portion of my esophagus, about 3 or 4 inches, while in a coma, the gastric juices washed back and actually burnt or digested the lower part of my esophagus, that when they checked me, my esophagus was shrunk, the lower part, to the diameter of like a cord that you would turn a light on and off with. And it was impossible food to enter in my stomach. They thought I had lost the will to live. I would eat, it would pile up so high, and it would feel like someone would stick their finger down my throat and it would come out. They thought I had lost the will to live. So on top of everything else, I was also dying of starvation. So they did a surgery and inserted what's called a gastrostomy tube. It was about as big as around as this finger and had a little ball on the end. And they would throw everything in a blender, mix it up with medicine, and a little cute little girl came around and give everybody a tray. And, oh, Mr. Robinson, we have your lunch. And she would hang this plastic bag up on a hook and let this clothespin-like thing go. And this blenderized goop would come down and go into me. I wish they had warmed it up, because they would just shiver. It gave me a new horrible definition of a bag lunch. Everybody else was getting food, and this is what I got like 3 or 4 times a day. And I could smell, and I was hungry. And I weighed 90 some pounds. And I remember I was still on death's door for probably, the accident was August 15th. I deteriorated. I don't know when exactly this point of when I had this incredible heavenly encounter happened. But I was on death's door for probably 3 months, and then just so fragile. They didn't know why I was alive and why I was seemingly getting stronger. But as that fluid began to come in, I began to get a little strength, and the doctor came in. And in addition to all the other complications, my legs had become completely rigid. And as I said, the nerves from my knees down all the way to the ends of my toe, all those muscles were all atrophied. The nerves were dead and the muscles didn't work. And my legs were completely out, stiff, straight. And I remember the doctor came in and picked up both of my legs. And he says, "We got to get you moving." And he pushed my knees about up to my chin. And I heard all these my muscles had shrunk down to like little rubber bands and were all stuck together, what's called adhesions. It was like a bunch of ropes popping. Felt terrible. But they began to take me down to physical therapy and put me in first a whirlpool bath. And then we get it real warm and put a box of Dreft diaper soap in there. And I remember the first time they plunged me in there, the water turned blood red, and I could see parts of my body that were dead tissue bubble off. And they would pick me up and put me in a wheelchair. I immediately would pass out and wake up either in the bed or the elevator. But it was those few minutes in that whirlpool actually felt a little bit comfortable, and my body was beginning to be able to move. And this incredible machine called the human body, which the Bible describes as that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, as disastrous as I was affected with all these complications, the slightest movement, the slightest help began to generate life. And the person that had so many things wrong, I began to come alive again. And the doctor said, "We got to get you moving." So after a series of going down there every day and being cleansed, they said, "We got to get you moving." And so they were going to attempt to see if I could hold my weight. Even though the lower parts of my legs, the muscles were dead, they put Velcro around my legs and had rubber loops, and they put me in these slippers, and they took me down between two parallel bars, and they lifted me up, and I took with my upper muscles in my thigh muscles, I dragged one foot forward and the other foot forward, and then backwards, a total of about 2.5 steps, and then collapsed in the chair. And when I stood up, all of the tissue where there's skin grafts, which it looked like patchwork quilt, they all cracked open, and rivulets of blood were running down my legs, filled up my slippers, and I was standing up. They were holding me up in the back, and with my one hand on the parallel bars, I was standing up. And I might as well have won the Super Bowl and won a gold medal in the Olympics or climb Mount Everest all at the same time. Telling you that you're never going to walk again and standing up for the first time was, for me, a former athlete, very exhilarating. And I started to be able to gain some strength. And then they had to move me because there was a staph infection in one of the patients, and they had to set up an artificial kind of intensive care on the first floor. And I remember it must have been a Sunday afternoon, and for some reason, there was always people visiting me, but there was no one there for this particular segment of time. And a man came walking up to the bed, and I remember that day, I was so weak. I couldn't lift my arm up even if I wanted to like scratch my face. The only thing that wasn't completely wrecked was this part of my body. And I was so weak, I could barely move. And he introduced himself, and he was carrying a Bible. He said, "Hi," whatever he said his name was. He says, "Can I pray for you?" Okay, fine. No one had asked to pray for me, and I didn't know very much about prayer. And this is after I had the heavenly encounter and all that, and had this experience with the Spirit. And he prayed for me, and I wish I could remember what he said. And he says, "Is it okay if I read you something out of the Bible?" Remember, I'm so weak, I cannot move a muscle. He opened the Bible and he began to read. And as soon as he read the words from the Bible, something way down here began to shake my body. And I started to shake so much as the more that he read, pretty soon my legs were shaking and my arms and legs were flapping. The bars of the hospital bed were clanging. And I sat up and I said, "I've got to be some kind of priest or something. I've been reborn. Now, I've never heard of born again or reborn. I didn't know where that, I just spewed that out. And I was basically declaring something about my life that I didn't even know. And this poor man, he says, no, just calm down. Don't worry. Just take it easy. I want to get a nurse. I could just see, he could imagine reading the newspaper the next day, Cleveland Plain Needle. Local pastor kills helpless burn victim. He thought that he had caused me to have some kind of a seizure or something because I was totally wrecked. And now I'm flapping all around. He was gone out of there. What really happened when he read the Bible, those words hit me. And when I heard those words, the Holy Spirit and my spirit got excited. And up out of me like a volcano came a living word of God that I believe was my first prophecy I declared over myself. And I believe that activated more of my healing. And more importantly, it unleashed my future destiny. And I remember that as vividly as if it happened this morning. He left and, he never came back again. Maybe someday I'll meet him or he'll run into me and I'll thank him for his kindness. But though that really happened, and when I said they had me walking, they had moved me into isolation because there was a terrible flu that year in 1968 called the Hong Kong flu. It was an Asian flu. And it was so, people were dying from it. If it would have got to me, I would have died. So everybody that came in to this room, they had to put on head covering, complete gown, stuff over their shoes, gloves. I mean, they had to be uncomfortably hot. And there I was, pretty much naked and in bandages. And I didn't get sick from that, but somehow I got sick and I got weak and I could no longer walk anymore. And it was the end of the year. It was Christmas Eve, 1968, December 24th. I remember it because I said I was an avid fan of aviation. I studied everything from birds, balloons, Wright brothers, Zeppelins, NASA. I knew everything about the space program. And Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1968, the United States had launched Apollo 8, the first people to go to the moon, not land on it, but to go around the moon. And when I was watching on television with the largest television audience at that time in the history of the world. And as the Apollo 8 capsule went around the backside of the moon, radio communications is cut off. Nobody knew. Did they crash into the moon? Did they skip off, miss the moon's gravity and go out, irretrievable death? And it was about 30 or 40 minutes went by and Apollo 8 came down around the backside of the moon. And they didn't say, hey, it's us, we're okay, it's Apollo 8. Hello, I'm Captain. It was Jim Lovell, Richard Beeman. There's three well-known astronauts, Jim Lovell of Apollo 13 fame. And what was heard, the first words heard from an extraterrestrial flight from the planet Earth was, in the beginning, God. And they read the book of Genesis. And when they got down to verse 10, I burst into tears with uncontrollable crying. Not tears of sadness because of what had happened to me. Not tears of hopelessness because I had taken a few steps and now I couldn't walk anymore. And they said I was never going to walk again the rest of my life. But it was tears of hope. Because earlier, the President of the United States made a faith declaration that the United States of America would send men to the moon and bring them back safely before the end of the decade. And that same Holy Spirit, the Spirit of the living God, the Spirit that gives us hope eternal, not hope for a measure or for a season or for a limit, was speaking inside me. Hope. If we could send a man to the moon, and when the scriptures were read, and it was down around about the 10th verse, and I would like to look it up and quote it because for some reason that triggered, they read the whole chapter 1. Hope was exploding in me when there was no hope. And about a month after that, actually on January 20th, I was transferred from that first hospital after 167 days to a rehabilitation hospital on the east side of Cleveland, a 400-bed building filled with every type of medical, surgical ward, every type of therapeutic apparatus. Most of the people who lived in there, they were basket cases. Most of the people that would be in there, a lot of the people in there would never come out of there alive. And they sent me there for rehabilitation. And remember when I got there, I went there by ambulance. And when I arrived at this rehabilitation hospital, the whole team of doctors wanted to examine me. So they unraveled all the bandages. I looked like the mummy. And there I was. And I remember when the air hit me, it was like thousands of little knives going in there. And I was in so much pain. And they all had to, examine me and take stock, all that, make a plan for how they're going to take care of me. And for the first time, my mother, who was the only person who didn't think I was going to die, she would always tell the doctor, "Is he out of the woods yet?" Said, "Mrs. Robinson, he's not going to come out of the woods." She tried to convince her that I was going to die. I think that God blinded her from the fact how bad I was hurt. My brother said I looked like I got in another plane crash on the way over to the hospital after 167 days. But this wretched wreck of a man in this rehab hospital where had all this equipment, they put me in a room, and then I eventually was on a surgical ward where I was having surgical procedures twice a week. And a man barely alive, but full of life. If that's an oxymoron, then that's a new one. I was barely alive, but I was more full of life than I can even describe to you. They began to take care of me. And first of all, they had to still cover up all these open areas. So there had to be a lot of skin grafting. Secondly, they had to rehab me. And so I went to this massive rehabilitation unit where the first thing they did was put me on like a stretcher and hoist me up with a chain lift. And it was a giant whirlpool bath. It's called a Hubbard tank. It's like in the shape of a cross and had all these jets. And that warm water, it was never warm enough. I always felt good in there. I remember the therapist would push my withered legs and muscles and trying to get them to move. And then they would take me. They had a plan. And I had something wrong with every department they had in the hospital. I was blind in one eye, so I had to go to the eye doctor. I had smashed my face so bad that this tooth was turned black, and I had to have a bone graft and a steel thing put in there to save that tooth. So I went in the dental department. About every department in there, so all the doctors and heads of those departments knew me and knew all the things wrong with me. The legs were paralyzed and nerve damage. I was fitted with leg braces. And I remember when I started to be conscious enough that I wasn't sick, and they took all my pain medicine away, which was pretty inconvenient. On top of everything else, I went through drug withdrawal with all that pain. And I remember the first time I saw myself in the mirror, I had this hanging gown on, and I was barely just bones, maybe I was up to 102 pounds and still had, I had a big patch on my eye and my head still had a bandage up from the head injuries. And the guy is really skinny, and this hand was always bandaged because the hand was so badly damaged, it was really useless. And my arm had withered, and I couldn't move it any farther than about 6 inches from my side. And this arm was frozen. The bones were stuck together, and I couldn't turn it like this, which is called pronation and supination. I just remember one day, now I have to remember, I didn't know anything about healing, but somehow I knew to say and do certain things. And I just told myself, I said, this arm's going to get better. And I took my hand like this and I went, and something popped and I was able to move it. And all I wanted to do, I was just full of this zeal for life. And I knew I was going to get better. And I knew that I was going to walk again, even though they said it was impossible. They put electrodes on my nerves, the neurologist, and determined that the nerves were dead. And this was a long period of time. And by now, what I'm told is the length of time that the nerves were dead, all of the myelin would be off of the nerves. So that makes the nerves dead and really they won't regenerate. Now, the upper body, other muscles on my body worked. And so they would take me to therapy, and I had these straps and then on for braces and would learn how to drag myself around it. And there was an acceleration of the healing process. I mean, they thought, first of all, I'm not going to live. And then they thought, I'm never going to get out of a wheelchair. And now I began to be able to get movement back. And it was like, there was just an acceleration. But inside, I really believed I was going to get out and be normal. And no one told me that. I didn't read any books. I didn't know about healing. I just had life working in me. And I just tried as hard as I could. And even though that some of the therapy was hard, there was always a person that God would bring in my life to give me another push forward, where it was one of the hallmarks, I hope, of my life and of my helping other people is that I can be encouragement. And I have a definition for it. It's like imparting spiritual bravery to live a life beyond what's normal. Real encouragement is divine bravery to live supernaturally in a life that would restrict you. Because in every way, there was a lot of restrictions, but I was kept pushing the envelope and doing things that I wasn't supposed to be able to do. I had a lot of visitors, and now I was in a room, and my three roommates, to my right was a man named Bob, who was a pre-law student who had been in a car accident and broke his neck. He was a C4 quadriplegic. And at that time, they would treat a quadriplegic because they would drill holes in your head, put these two prongs in there, and through a cord with a large weight, would straighten your neck out, and he would do a bone graft or a graft to fix the broken neck. Across from him was a black man named Larry. He also was a C4 quad. It was in a minor car accident, but snapped his neck. He had holes drilled in his head, and he had this thing with weights on it holding him steady until the bone graft would heal. And across from me was a white Appalachian man who somebody broke in his house and shot him with a gun and bruised his spine, and he was paralyzed from here down. And then there's me, the ex-stockbroker, skydiver. In the world, we would have nothing in common. But in there, we loved each other. We told stories. We told jokes. My visitors, which were many, would visit all of them. And in the world, we would have passed each other by and wouldn't have had two things to talk about. But in there, we had one common thing. We had been broken, and we made life and love. We joke as much as we could and made it bearable. Just as I was starting to get a little better, what I mean starting to get a little better, I was starting to really believe that I could get better. And my kid brother, Robbie, had been taken by a close friend of mine, one of the premier skydivers, to Florida for a vacation to get away from all the trouble. They were gone for about a week, and they came back, and they came into the hospital to see me. And a sign of healing is humor. And they probably wondered that while they were gone, did I get better or did I get worse, because I was so borderline. And so they kind of snuck their head in the door, said, "Mick, how you doing?" And I said, "Well, I guess I made a real ash out of myself." That was my first conscious thing I remember, something funny, and they laughed. And actually, I'd almost died the day before from an anesthetic overdose, but I began to feel life, and laughing is healthy. A merry heart is better than medicine. It's good like medicine. But these guys in this room with me, and about that same time when I just started getting better and I just started being able to move around, I got a phone call from the gal I had gone with and the girl I had gone with all through high school. And we were supposedly going to get engaged that Christmas, which had just passed. But of course, in August, I got in this plane wreck. And the only thing that I was holding on to in my former life was that relationship. And I got a phone call. This is before cell phones or personal phones. The nurse called and said, "You have a phone call." So I rolled out my wheelchair to a payphone. I heard over the phone the girl that I loved all the way through high school for three and a half years, and we were going to get engaged. Didn't have to tell me in person, but told me over the phone that we didn't have a life anymore, that the relationship was over. I said, "No, we have all this plan," and I just couldn't believe it. And I hung up, and I remember rolling myself down at the end of the hall into a shady place. And I remember just, letting it all out. When I came back in my room, I never told the guys what had happened. But that night, about 3:00 in the morning, when the room was totally dark, I began to sob, cry like the most broken person in the world. And had my face buried in the pillow because I didn't want to wake anybody up. But from across the room, through the darkness, from that corner over there, the voice of this man, Larry Jones, with his head with these two prongs in it, said, "Man, you don't worry. They're going to fix you up. You're going to be back out on the street. You're going to be doing all that cool stuff you always wanted to do." And when his voice hit me, it was like waves of love hit me. And as his words hit me, all the sorrow went away. And in a few seconds, this deep hurt went away. And I was back in the love of God. This man who himself was in worse shape than me, God used to speak life. That was profound. In that darkness, I felt all of that sorrow go away because a person who wanted something good to happen to me spoke. And his voice got mixed with the power of the Holy Spirit, and that brought me comfort. Well, it was about 3 weeks later, at the same time of night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, that I woke up. I heard a loud clang. What had happened was those steel pins that were drilled in to the skull of Larry Jones somehow pulled out of his head, and the weights hit the floor. And his head was on a little pad. It's on what's called a striker frame. It's a big circular thing that they can turn a man upside down so they don't get bed sores every 2 hours. That pulled out of his head, and his head is resting on a pad with a fresh bone graft. If he had so much as a muscle spasm, his head would have fallen off that pad, and he'd be dead. His neck would have been resevered. I heard the clang. I dragged myself across the floor, and somehow I pulled myself up. I turned on the light, and I put this hand on one side of his head and this bandaged hand on the other. With his blood running through my fingers, I began to cry out, "Nurse! Nurse! Get some help right now!" I screamed, "Help! Help!" I had his life in my hands, a man who 3 weeks before gave me life. And that's how this life can be. We're either going to give life or we're going to take life. This man had emotionally saved my life, and now I had his life in my hands. I looked in his eyes, and I had such love and such determination that even though I could barely stand up, I wasn't going to move until help came. The words that we speak can bring life, and that abundantly. And I was in that hospital again. I had all these things wrong with me. They said I'm never going to walk again. And somehow I knew things that I didn't know. From that time on, after those experiences with Larry, personal ones with him and I was going to therapy, and I just had this in me about getting completely better. I don't know why. I never read anything. I didn't know about healing, but in physical therapy, they would tell me, you're going to be able to do so much, but I knew that they thought I would only be limited. And I kept breaking their expectations. I remember because I had to have a surgical procedure twice a week, and the days that I had surgery, I didn't have physical therapy, and I was into physical therapy because movement and cooperating accelerates healing. And whatever I was doing was working. But when I was in my room, I had little weights and sandbags in there, and I would exercise when I couldn't have therapy. And for some reason, no one taught me this, and I didn't hear it. I would just speak to my legs. I'd say, "Move." And this leg was a little bit more obedient. It'd be like the James Dobson compliant child leg, and it began to move. But this leg was like the strong-willed, disobedient, rebellious leg. And no matter how much you wanted to, and I could try and exercise my mind, that leg would not move, and very frustrating. And then one day, I was scheduled to go in for surgery. I said, "Move." And my leg, which I had complete bilateral foot drop, in other words, my foot would hang completely down dead, it was completely restored. I took off the leg brace, and I'm walking around the room, and I was completely healed. And I rang the buzzer, brought the nurses in, and they looked at me, and they were all afraid. And I never once ever again had to use crutches or be in a wheelchair or wear leg braces. And it was completely healed, and they had no explanation how that can happen. And all I wanted to do was do more. And I remember, just prior to that, I had gone to the wedding of the girl I had visited in the hospital, or the one I was going to be in for so long. Well, she got married to her boyfriend, and I went there, and that's the last time I saw my girlfriend. And I remember somebody found me some clothes of a really skinny person that would fit me, because I probably weighed all of 115 pounds, and I still had that leg brace on at that time, actually, before the healing. And my sister's friend came and got me and drove 100 miles an hour to this little church, and I was the last one in. I closed the door and sat in the back, and the wedding party was recessing, coming out, and the bride and groom saw me, and they just stopped, and everybody else kind of crashed into them, and they ran up, and everybody hugged me. They couldn't believe that there I was standing with clothes on, the person that they all knew was in a hospital in bandages, never coming out again. And I saw it, and as I walked out of that church, I realized all those people, all my friends, and that whole life really was over at the crash scene. That I had a new life, and I was beginning to meet the man that was born again. And I was beginning to understand there was a different purpose for life than anything I'd ever known before. And I went back to the hospital, and then that healing happened to my leg, and everything began to accelerate with me getting better. And I was still, I still had the rubber tube in my stomach, but I remember as they opened up my esophagus, twice a week, they would pull this, I had this string coming out of my nose, and they would tie these silver little bullet things on there. They were trying to expand my scarred esophagus, and they said, you'll never be normal, and you'll need operations like a couple times a year. And they kept stretching it. I remember the first thing I ate was bowls of liquefied mashed potatoes. It might as well have been steak and filet mignon. To eat was so amazing. And I began to eat, and then they made it a little bigger, and I ate a little bit more, and I began to eat, and they still had that rubber hose in there, and I began to get stronger. And the more that I did, and the more that I envisioned myself doing things, I actually thought I was going to be able to do everything I could think of. And my partner, my old skydiving partner, came in with a brand new parachute, and I tried it on, and all the nurses and therapists thought, oh my God, he's crazy. And they really planned for me to jump out of I planned to jump out of an airplane again. And I remember my therapist says, don't you ever to try to do that with this leg brace on. Well, little did she know, little did I know that leg brace would come off and I would never need it again. But I still was, I still was pretty skinny and frail. Pictures that even surprise me now. But I got released from the hospital about the end of June. And I remember packing up my things, the meager little amount of personal items I had. My three roommates, Bob, the law student, Larry, the man from the inner city, the black man from the inner city, and this Appalachian guy. And we didn't talk much. He said, man, saying goodbye to them was a little bittersweet because I hadn't gotten miraculously better, and they were pulling for me. But I was walking out of a place that was never in a kind of a life and a kind of a suffering and overcoming that in many ways I was never going to have to pass that way again. And I was leaving them. So it was a little bittersweet. But I remember going out the front door and the sunlight hitting me. And I was free from a lot of things. And we take for granted the simple things in life, like going to your own home, opening your own drawer, having people that know you in like places. I went from being this world-class athlete, stockbroker, skydiver, to becoming a totally helpless, dependent on other human hands for my very existence. And now I was free again. But I was walking into a freedom that I was going to have to learn in incremental steps of faith. Things were happening to me. I was having spiritual communication with God, but I didn't have anybody to talk to. I was hearing things from God, learning things. I understood things that just did not come from regular life. And yet this love of people and love for life was overwhelming. And I remember going home for the first time, walking into my own house, and just it was overwhelming, the appreciation and the thankfulness. I was re-given the gift of life. In the movie Braveheart, there's a line by the actor Mel Gibson playing a character, William Wallace. It says, every man dies, but not every man really lives. Well, for me, how many people die and get a second chance to live again, but not just live, but to live a supernatural life? And that's my perspective. And it's for everyone who's alive. It's not about dying and going to heaven, which is very important. It's about having heaven impact our life so much here that we live a heavenly life, a supernatural life as we live in this broken and maladjusted world. And that's the world I came out into. And even though I didn't have a lot of the language, I had all of the love. I had all of the joy and all of the peace. And the world I came into it seemed like it changed overnight. I mean, I was in the hospital for nearly 1 year. And from 1968 to 1969, everything had changed in the area where I lived. I mean, 1967 was the summer of love, but 1968 was a very brutal year. It was violent. It was angry. It was rebellious. There was all kinds of agitation. And there was just where I lived, there was the whole beginning of smoking marijuana and all that stuff. And now all these people had long hair, and men were burning their draft cards, and the women were burning their bras, and marijuana was so illegal that the boys would go in the woods and smoke. I think they were more afraid of telling their girlfriends they were getting caught by the police. But this was a time of tremendous social change. But I was seeing them through different eyes. And I just loved everybody and everything, although that is a little bit naive, because not everything, you can love something, but you can't have everything and you can't do everything. And I just had this love for life, and I got very attracted. Well, first I have to say that I did make that parachute jump. I went out to sometime in July. It was less than 1 year after my accident, and it had been arranged. And I finally told my mom that we were going on a picnic out to the skydiving club, and she got in the car with us, my brother and my partner. She didn't know I was going to jump that day. We got there and got on the plane with the guy that saved my life and my kid brother, who was the country's youngest skydivers, and went up to 12,500 feet. Out we went, formed a 3-man star in free fall. It's incredible. I mean, it was the only time I probably was a little bit worried about jumping out of an airplane. It wasn't about getting hurt. It was I heavy enough to actually fall all the way to the earth? And, oh, there's the 6 o'clock news, and there's a cold front coming in, and there's that guy caught in the jet stream going around. No, I actually didn't. We made contact and formed a 3-man star and made faces at each other and opened my parachute, 2,000 feet. It was incredible, and landed, and the national champion and another member of the U.S. team were there. They all rushed and they all celebrated. They couldn't believe that I did that. And it was great and it was exhilarating, but it did not have the draw that it once had, because there was something far more exciting for me to do than enjoy the pleasures of jumping out of an airplane. And I did, the skydivers, some of the people that stuck with me through thick and thin. And so that summer was the summer of Woodstock. And I remember I almost went to Woodstock. I got in the car with a bunch of people, and they were going, and so something stopped me and said, "Don't go." And I got out, and I let them out of my house, and I didn't go. And I'm thankful I didn't go to Woodstock. As I had been later, I went to one rock festival, and it was just chaotic. And this had become a new normal. And after the summer was over, I actually had to go back in the hospital that summer and close the opening in my stomach that they thought would close by itself. And by then, I was eating normally, which they said I'd never eat. And they let me get strong. And then I went back in the hospital, like in the beginning of September, and I started having massive, what is called reconstructive surgery. Like, this hand was so badly damaged, it really wasn't good for much of anything except using it as an opposable force to pick something up like this. And they had to excise or cut off all the scar tissue off this hand. It looked like this. If you've seen it, something severely burned, like a corpse or something, you'll see the thin areas contract. So this hand was just like this. Nothing worked. And they amputated everything all the way down around here. And they took all the scar tissue off, and they cut a pouch and put a skin graft on the inside and put my hand in there and sewed my hand under here. It's called a pedicle graft, where the skin would have to grow onto my hand. And they put all this padding in there and let it grow there for 6 weeks. So I went around 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, 7 days a week with my hand stuck in here. I believe I probably have the longest running theatrical impersonation of Napoleon than anybody doing any theater anywhere. And after 6 weeks, while I was awake, they made a cut here, and they left 1 inch here and 1 inch here. And then they put me stick. And later on, they cut it all out, and they made it, and it looked like this. All of this was just like a little boxing glove all enclosed. They let that heal. And then several months later, and there was all kinds of surgery. I had to do all kinds of reconstructive surgery. They had to do a large graft here because I couldn't move my head any farther than this. My ear was burned completely off. I remember when they cut it off with a pair of scissors, what was left of it, and they made what's out of a material called Celastic. It looks like the inside cartilage of your ear, and they let skin grow through it, and they pull it out, and they put a skin graft behind it. And where I had no ear, then I suddenly had an ear. Now, there was nothing wrong with the inside of my ear, but there was no ear on the outside. So they were very creative. I mean, I was the block of marble for Michelangelo. I mean, a surgeon, it was like getting a birthday present. There was no end to the amount of cutting they could do on me. And it was just having operations all the time. But the one on my hand, it was one aspect of remarkable healing they had. Finally done all this elaborate, they had to move bones around. It was like a UHF wire going through here one time to move things around. And then they did a very big operation where they cut all the way down through the metacarpal bones and moved all this skin around and sewed it all up. And then they bandaged it all up. And the main doctor went to do a seminar in the Dominican Republic. And after 3 days, the doctor that was the resident or the next guy on call was to come in and change the bandage. And I remember he'd set up a whole little place there, and he started taking off the bandage, and I heard him say, "Oh my God, no. That's not a good thing you want to hear. That's really not what you want to hear." And it looked, and the whole hand, all the surgical site was all black. It was a complete failure. All the tissue was dead, and it smelled like a dead animal on the side of the road. And he says, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Robinson. We lost it all. We're going to have to start all over again." And everybody was very sober. They were very upset. They were very sad. This was a massive operation, and all this tissue all around here was dead. They left the room, and I thought for a moment, and then I rang the buzzer, and I called the nurse in. I said, "I want about 7 or 8 pillows, and get me one of those heat lamps." And for some reason, then they had bandaged my hand back up, and I put my hand on that pillow, and they closed the door. And as the sun was going down, I began to command blood to go into my hand because I knew that blood supply was what carried oxygen and fresh blood for healing. Now, I have a scientific background, especially in the area of biology, and I knew that those arteries were like dried Elmer's glue of coagulated blood, but I didn't even think of that. I just commanded blood. I stayed up all night, and I stared intently at my hand. The doctor was coming in the next day to cut off all the dead tissue and begin again. And so he unraveled it, and he got down to the end, and he goes, "Oh my God." And he fell up against the wall, and he was terrified because my skin was completely healed, like brand new baby skin, and it's never been touched since then. And that is a creative miracle. That tissue that was dead was resurrected into live tissue. And that blood that there's no way it could have gone in any direction, either couldn't have gone into my hand or come out of it, somehow got into my hand. And that was a resurrected hand, a healing that made me be able to have my hand back again. I'll never forget the sound of that man's voice. First of all, it was tremendous sorrow because scientifically he knew it was a loss, but he couldn't explain what happened. And today, in today's world, the same Spirit, the Apostle Paul writes in Romans, the same Spirit that resurrected Jesus from the dead shall quicken or enliven or energize, energize your natural body. How much more can we believe that Spirit can energize us? I want to believe more. If I, a naive young burn victim, for some reason I stared and went against my own logic and reasoning. I didn't even think about it. I just wanted that skin to be alive. I didn't ever hear of anybody do healing. I didn't see it on TV. I didn't imagine. I just spoke those words, and somehow it worked, just like with my leg. And all the things about getting better were accompanied by, I would take long walks, sometimes in the woods, and I would hear the voice of God. Sometimes it seemed like all day long I was encountering God, not for getting something out of him, but I realized that he was building a relationship with me that was personal. And I'm not the only person in the world that has experiences like this. It's for everybody, but I would go for long walks alone. And usually I'm a person who likes to hang around with people, but some of the most peaceful and pleasant times some of those profound things would happen. And in our society, there was a big, social movement about anti-war, about the use of recreational drugs, marijuana, LSD. The music was given permission to break all the boundaries, love the one you're with, free love, free this, free that. And yet in the midst of that, a lot of these people were seeking truth, and sometimes they'd mix it up with some form of maybe Eastern religion and psychology, a magazine they read, or the lyrics of a song. Some people were seeking truth. But then in the midst of that, some of these truth seekers found out that truth isn't a philosophy. It's not a set of rules. It's not an ancient religion. That truth is a person. And that person is Jesus Christ. And the Spirit that he sent, the Holy Spirit, one of his names is the Spirit of truth. And people were becoming enlightened to Jesus Christ being the Messiah, being the Lord, being the one that can take all your sins away and give you a brand new life. Now, I experienced this alone and sovereignly, but suddenly people were popping up in my life amidst the crowd of people, the same crowd of people that were going to rock festivals, going to clubs, playing music, growing their hair, smoking these things, and coming up with all these wild psychedelic ideas. Every now and then, some of them would come alive and say that someone personally had changed their life, and that person that they know is Jesus. One such person was a young man that I had really gone to this place relatively near where he lived for music. It was a college university, Kent State, and there was a lot of clubs, and some of my favorite, I knew some of the people in some of these bands. One of them went on to be one of the biggest bands in the United States, and his guitar player. And I went on one night to hear this, I went on one night to hear who I thought was going to be playing, and there was a little sign on the door, a little piece of paper written on it, said Glass Harp. And I go, what is that? And I went in there, and there was a young man in there. It was a three-piece band, and he was a guitarist. And he played guitar like nobody I ever heard. His name was Phil Kagi. Nice young guy, and amazing musician. And I remember how good that was. And then I went back in the hospital, and there was a whole series of operations. And I came back. And when I came back months and months later and went and visited there and saw him, something was different. It's as if he had installed lighting in his face. He just glowed. And the lyrics to all of his songs were changed. And in between songs, he was talking about Jesus. He had found Jesus as his Lord and Savior. And he told everybody about it. I remember sitting on a pool table in this bar in Kent, Ohio, and he would say, look, I got one. He was talking about my hand. He had an accident when he was 3 years old. He cut the middle finger off on his right hand on a well. He says, I'm not much of a finger picker. Well, he plays guitar like he's got 3 hands. I mean, he's a phenomenal guitar player. And to this day, I've known him for now, I guess, about 47 years. And he's the same humble, kind, honest, creative. And he's playing guitar better than he ever had. But he could have been one of the greatest rock guitarists in the world. And he gave his talent to Jesus. But more importantly, he was never ashamed to be vocal about Jesus without being offensive. I remember there was a big outdoor concert on the shores of Lake Erie near where we lived, 100,000 people. And the most well-known disc jockey in the United States was in Cleveland, Ohio at that time. And he goes, this is the band that made this event last year, Glass Harp. Now that morning, the weather was building up. The sky was getting black, and they got up to play, and they started playing some songs I was familiar with because I probably had seen him 50 times. And one song was called Look in the Sky. And as he started playing those chords, there began to be a little bit of light behind those black clouds. And then you could see this hazy, mellow disc. And then you could see the sun. And then the sky opened up. And by the time they were finished, it was a blue sky. And this famous DJ got up and goes, wow, there really must be something to all this Jesus stuff. And they were going to strike the set, and the next band came up, very well-known band from our area, nationally, internationally known. By the time they got set up, the sky turned black again, it rained, and it was all over. It's like God honored his word by controlling the weather. He said, look in the sky. Everybody was looking in the sky, expecting it to rain, and instead the sun came out. Well, that person and many others like him, men and women, began to have an impact I was looking all over for the truth. I read every book about every type of belief system, from Eastern religion to Western psychology, every form of religion. But always Jesus kept coming up. And I remember I went to hear a concert once, and I got separated from my friends. There was about 1,000 people there. And I was just standing there thinking within myself, I don't have anybody to talk to. And I had my eyes down. And I said, nobody understands what I'm going through. And I felt this pressure on my shoulders. And as these inner words were coming out of really kind of a place, even though I was in a big crowd and I was with, some people that I knew, I felt so lonely and so dissociated that I was having all these experiences and no one to really share them with. And as I looked up, there was this young woman with long, brown, wavy hair, tears running down her face, big bell-bottom pants on, and she was crying. She says, "Oh, Lord, he's so beautiful. Take him deeper." And again, I felt these waves of love come over me. These words came out of this girl. It's like before I could even say anything, God spoke to some person clear across an auditorium of 1,000 people, and she came over to me. There was nothing outwardly I was doing, but inwardly. And I could hear the voice of the Lord say, "Mickey, I know everything about you, and you can always talk to me. I know everything that you're going through, and I will always be with you." I don't know who that woman was. I hope I meet her someday on this earth, and hope she remembers that moment, because her words changed my life. And the person of Jesus kept becoming more real and real and real as time went on. And this same Jesus, no matter who you are or what you're going through, he knows everything about you. He knows everything you've done. He knows exactly how you feel. He knows exactly where you're at right now. And he can change your life as dramatically as he is changing mine. I just breathe on you the name of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And I ask the Holy Spirit to let your heart be open, wide open, because he is the one you can put your trust in. It's worked for me, and it will work for you.